We've got folks going in here. I'm trying to switch my views around. Thank you all for joining us. I am short on banter as we let the all of you interested in local regional food systems here to join us. This is our fourth webinar in our series as part of our National Cooperative Agreement, looking at how local and regional food systems are adapting and responding to the COVID disruption. And this month, for those, if you don't know what webinar you're here for, this month we're looking at the roles of policies as they're implemented across the different levels of our communities, local level, state level, how we interact with federal policies. We may touch on how some tribal communities are working on it, I don't know. And we are incredibly honored. We have all of our panels have been all-star. If you've joined us, if this is your first webinar, go back and watch the last ones. And this one is the brightest star in the constellation yet. So we're so thankful to our panelists who are joining us today. My co-host, Lisa Benson, is with the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture. She is going to be our August facilitator. If you've come before, you're used to seeing me, I'm just here in a supporting role because she really knows the chops of this policy world. And this, as I mentioned, this is the fourth in our webinar. We are a collaborative of 17 communities of practice, ranging from farmers markets to niche meat to state departments of agriculture. It's an incredible group. We've been working together since this past summer to understand the real-time adaptations that are happening on the ground and trying to return those to our local regional food system community as quickly as possible for you to digest, be inspired by. I encourage you, we'll share some links to check out our resource hub. There's tons of incredible publications, links to videos, fact sheets for you all working on the ground to take inspiration from the work that's happening across local and regional food systems. We have a series of innovation briefs that are these really bite-sized case studies of specific activities people are taking. We have sector profiles and our impact assessments that show you sector by sector what's been happening, and we'll continue to have these webinars. So we're incredibly honored to have this piece as part of it. And today, as I mentioned, we're looking specifically at the role of policy. And we're going to start off with the conversation of what do we mean when we say that? Because it's a small word that we're trying to fit a lot of different types of things into, because that's the nature of governance, not necessarily government. We think about the difference between those things. And I would encourage you, if you are not one of our panelists, you can turn your video off and stay on mute. We do have the chat, it's very active. I will monitor it. My fellow panelists, my fellow research team behind the scenes will monitor and work to integrate your questions as we go, as we're able. And there will be a follow-up after today's webinar. We'll send out a summary. There's always a link to, and any links that are shared, and then we'll have a link to this recording, which reminds me, I hope we're recording. I think we are. I'll ping my CSU team to do it. And with that, I will turn it over to Lisa.
Great, thank you so much. Well, let me introduce our amazing panelists. And one thing we were just chatting about before we all got on was we're all women today, which is kind of cool. So we're talking about state policy, we're talking about local community policy, we're talking about programs and COVID. But let me introduce you to the amazing women that are on our panel today. We've got Liz Wells Ogilvie, director of the Springfield Food Policy Council. She tells us that the kids call her Liz OG, so I think that might be on the table. Leilani Nelson, the associate director and research fellow for the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems, Vermont Law School. The Iowa Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, Julie Kenney, and the Colorado Commissioner of Agriculture, Kate Greenberg. So we've got an amazing panel with us today, and I'll say that they come from state work and local community work and across the board. So feel free, as we're discussing things, to put your own questions in the chat, but let me get things kicked off with Leilani. So first I'm going to start off with, what do we mean by policy? Policy can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So Leilani, can you help provide a little bit of a framework for today's conversation, discussion? When we're looking at the local and the regional level, what types of policies or programs do you think can be most effectively addressed during this time of COVID when we have a lot of need?
Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Leilani Nelson. Those are some great questions to get this started, and I will do my best. They're big questions. I'll first start by saying, so at the Center for Ag and Food Systems, we focus on food and ag law and policy. from a food systems perspective. And I think that's today what we're all trying to get at here is building local and regional food systems and utilizing policy to support those systems. So let's just keep in mind that a food systems perspective means everything from farm inputs, food production, consumption, waste management, composting, and how the food system is situated within even broader systems, environmental, economic, health, social. So for example, we have to think about food and farm workers and supporting them as people. Those are critical pieces of supporting a strong local regional food system as well. And often food and farm workers are forgotten, for example. And so the question about policy and what do we mean by policy, we think in terms of a framework of the different levels being local, state, federal, and tribal. And tribal law is different as federally recognized tribes. They have a government to government relationship with the federal government. So that's due to sovereign powers of tribes. So I'm not going to get as much into that today because it's so different from what we think of as state and local and federal and those relations. But there's a lot of great work being done on food and ag and tribal law out there. And I can share some resources for those that are interested. One other thing that I just want to have on the front of our minds when we're talking about food and ag law and policy is that we, at least at CAST, we believe that supporting local and regional food systems should require also thinking about equity and racial equity. And if we want to build a just food system, it really requires a new framework of thinking, a new way of thinking about engaging and empowering communities to be part of the policymaking process. So part of that is thinking about the people that are most impacted and also disproportionately impacted, for example, by the pandemic. They should be empowered to help drive solutions as well. And I mean, I think we all know there's evidence showing that the BIPOC and Indigenous communities have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. And that's on top of historic disinvestment and disempowerment. So if we want to think about building strong local regional food systems, we have to think about doing that in a way that works for everyone. And right now our food system works for some and it doesn't work for others. And we want people to be at the table making decisions, those that have been left out. So just keeping that in mind as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some specific examples that we've been seeing come up at the local and community level. Here are some things that we've seen that a lot of communities are doing around the country. That includes supporting access to emergency food through like mobile food shelves. Also, you can, at the local level, there are certain tools like zoning and licensing that can help create more access to, say, urban agriculture or community gardens that doesn't make as much sense at the state level. That would be something that's more at that local level. Same with supporting community kitchens. Also school wellness policies, farm to school programs. Those are all often locally driven and can be supported by local policy. Another example are healthy food retail policies, which you may or may not heard of, but this isn't particular to COVID. This is something I just think people should be thinking about. At the local level, you can have an ordinance that requires a store to carry a minimum stock of fresh or minimally processed produce or staple foods. And there are cities across the country that have started doing that, which just is increasing access to healthy food. And you can bring local food into that. Local fruits and vegetables should be part of that. Also encouraging mobile markets, city operated farmers markets. There's so much happening at the local level. It's hard to like say, these are the policies. So those are just some examples. State, I would say the things that we've been seeing a lot of is reallocating funding to state programs like farm to school programs, or supporting farmers, direct support for farmers through different grants. Also using SNAP and increasing those benefits and making it more accessible. That's something that the state level is appropriate for. We've also seen, and I'll give more examples. I know we only have a certain amount of time per question here, and this is kind of like big picture. There's a lot going on at the state level to try to support workers and farmers. And the one last point here before we move on is that policy at different levels should be, it should be reflective of the community's needs. And that means there isn't one size fits all. So any examples that I'm going to give today, take it with a grain of salt, think about it as like a menu of options, but don't think that I can take that and apply it to my state directly or my community, because there's a wide range, and things that work in one state might not work in another state. So those are, I think I'm going to like wrap up and stop there because I see Lisa. I know that there's a lot of great panelists and questions to be asked, but hopefully that gives some framework for thinking about these questions today.
Thank you, Leilani. It's a big topic, and I appreciate you helping us kind of frame that up. As you mentioned, things happen differently at the state level than at the local level. So I'm going to now turn it over to Deputy Secretary Kenny to talk a little bit more about what's happening in Iowa. So we are going to get into some of your state's innovative work with Farm to School, something that Leilani mentioned. But with that in mind, how much of your work with local food systems is mediated by federal policies and programs? And can you share some examples of the federal policies or programs you worked with during COVID?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of this panel discussion. I think the topic is so critically important. I think we've learned a lot, certainly over the last year, and some of the challenges that we faced, so appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it. I should also mention, I am sitting in the middle of Iowa, and we are facing a crazy blizzard right now. So interesting to be talking about food production when we're facing, 12 to 14 inches of snow. So if I lose you, I will get back on as soon as I can. But thanks again for the opportunity to be on here. You talked about, I think your question really hits at some of the state work that we do and federal programs that have helped support it, specifically as it relates to COVID. And I can think of a couple specific examples where we have really worked with our federal partners, taken advantage of some federal programs to bring benefits at the state level and into local and regional food systems here within the state. And a couple I mentioned specifically is the Specialty Crop Block Grant that's administered with USDA. So important to us at the state level, year in and year out. But what we found during COVID was there was an opportunity to find some unique needs, specifically as it related to things like farmers markets and food hubs, and take advantage of that program, reallocate some of those funding streams in real time, some of those grant dollars, to help meet some of the needs and the challenges that our 200 farmers markets across the state and our 8 food hubs were facing specifically. So that was one thing where we were able to pivot a little bit and take advantage of some of those federal funding streams and programs. And then of course, as I'm sure is no surprise, the coronavirus relief funds and the CARES Act funding that came from the federal government, and how we were able to and have been able to use those funds to help impact local and regional food systems here. So, from the very beginning, we were facing some challenges with meat processing, for example. And so using those funds to help find some local solutions, help enable small and local meat processing to alleviate some supply chain disruptions, meet the needs of consumers here within the state, but also meet some pretty significant food security challenges that we were facing as well. So developed a number of grants and other programs using CARES funds for things like that. We developed a local produce and protein fund using CARES Act funds, again, to help with our Farm to School program. I think we'll talk about that maybe a little bit more later, so I won't expand on that too much. And then we had at the state level here what our governor called a Feeding Iowans Task Force, where she pulled together different state agencies, Iowa State University Extension, representatives from food hubs and other groups that work in the local foods area to try to identify some of the barriers that we were facing as a result of COVID, and really were able to use some of those CARES Act funds to help meet some of those needs and be just as nimble as possible during those times. So I know time is a little bit limited. I can certainly expand on any of those programs as you're interested, but again, thanks for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you so much. So we are now going to turn things over to Colorado. So I'll ask Commissioner Greenberg, when the pandemic hit, how did your department learn what the needs were within that local and regional food system? What were those tools that you had to address those needs, and how did you respond? Just trying to figure out what was happening on the ground.
Well, it was quite the busy time, to say the least, back almost a year ago now at the end of February of 2020. I think the bottom line is from day one, we've leaned on our relationships. And that is I think we're in a lucky position as a state government, and maybe Deputy Commissioner Kenny can attest to this as well, but we actually are part of our ag community. We work with businesses, we work with producers, we work with processors, even when we're not in a global pandemic. So that was where we started, was our relationships, leaning on our networks, calling people to figure out what was going on, what barriers were they facing, what were they anticipating coming down the pike. You'll remember in the early days of the pandemic, it was in ag, it was about keeping business open, keeping workers safe, and keeping supply chains functioning. And three big tasks and that we all had to tackle. I think from our end, what we did out the gates was really focus on organizing ourselves internally so that we could respond to our ag community. So we set up at the Department of Ag, we've got our emergency response team that we have never created such a big one to respond to such a large event. And we broke that out into our food supply and food security team. So we had a staff focusing on how can we get out ahead of any problems we're seeing coming down the pike, whether that's working with food banks to get food to hungry people, working with businesses who are seeing their supply chains back up. How can we help move pieces to make sure those still flow? We actually set up an ag recovery team at the very outset as we were just focusing on response. So starting to say, okay, where are dollars going to come from? Where is relief and support going to come from? How do we get that out to our ag community and also to our food security communities as well, playing a supporting role there. And then really just be representing agriculture everywhere we could was really part of our strategy from the get-go. And just lastly on this point, which I'll hopefully talk about a little bit later, we really leaned on external organizing rather than just the department as a sole entity to do this work. So on the recovery side, we actually helped set up a Colorado Farm and Food Systems Respond and Rebuild Fund made up of food banks, ag associations, and philanthropy as well, to start drawing, this is before CARES Act, to actually start drawing in private dollars to support the ag community. And we set up that framework then allowed us to actually very rapidly distribute funds when they started flowing from the federal government.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. I'll now turn things over to Liz Ogilvie, and she has a really interesting position as the director of the Springfield Food Policy Council. And so this is working at the local level, and it's also, I should mention too, non-governmental. So there's a unique, and correct me if I'm wrong, Liz, but you guys work with a lot of different communities and a lot of different organizations, but you are an independent entity. So if you could give people a little bit of the overview of the work that you do with the Springfield Food Policy Council, what stakeholders are involved in the council, and what kinds of initiatives you do for folks who may not be familiar with what you're already doing.
Happy to do so. And we are unique among food policy councils in that we are not a government body intentionally, because our work really grew out of marginalization and the need to do advocacy. Springfield's the third largest city in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the only city that is majority people of BIPOC folks. We are 85 to 88% people of color, yet every single department head is white with the exception of one in our city. And I came to Food Policy Council work as a resident and coming from urban ag. Our work is really built on years and years of relationship building. I told my fellow panelists, I'm probably a community organizer more than any other one thing. But my community that I'm organizing is just wherever I am. So I also serve on the state Mass Farm to School Board and the Mass Food System Collaborative. And the work that we have done in Springfield is heavily informed state policy. So while we move locally and we're driven by local stuff, we have been able to advance policy, and that's been really beneficial during the pandemic, because we could be the entity that said, yeah, the state's coming up with all of these strategies, and that's not going to trickle down to the people in communities. So if folks were recognizing that our entire food system in the Commonwealth was falling apart, and people in lower income lower wealth communities had been marginalized historically, we could see what was coming. We were able to, as a result, move really rapidly as a partner to agencies like the Massachusetts Food Policy Council, which is a governmental appointed body, but also to our farmer friends who we have been working hard to engage for years because we have an urban ag movement. And I think the thing that I'd like folks to take away is it's harder to start a food policy council when you're not governmental owned, because we have to raise money just like every other nonprofit, and they don't think policy is sexy. So that's a big challenge. But we have a body, a steering committee that's 51% resident representation. The other 49% have appointed department heads that the mayor selects and identifies. And they are people like the head of planning, the head of health and human services, the head of the Department of Public Works. So we have every entity that we would be working with, or we would hope to work with, and we don't ask them to do anything except show up and give us advice. And we built these long relationships, so when we need something to happen, we were able to call them up and say, can you dig in? So when we saw the pandemic coming, we could call our school district and say, and our food service producer, and we serve 31,000 kids citywide, free breakfast and lunch, we could say, what's the plan? Because we had helped make that happen, and we helped make it happen universally across the state. So that meant being able to inform how we used pandemic funding to feed kids. Hitting the ground running like that really validated us in very different ways. And when all this emergency money for food started coming down the pike, we could say legitimately, yes, we need that food, but we also need to continue to work upstream as we had been trying to do for years. So it became a moment of opportunity within this moment of just complete horror, that we were able to propose policies that were going to, we hoped, last beyond COVID. And now we're in the middle of legislative season. So everything I hear every other state say today, I am going to be writing down for ideas, because now's the time to manage it. And because we became such a great resource, folks were listening.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Liz. Well, we've heard a lot about good things going on, so we're going to dig into that. So our next kind of panel of questions to get you guys ready is for lessons learned. So we want to look at some of the cool innovations, initiatives that came out of people trying to address the real need that COVID was causing and the ripple effect through the communities and the states. So I'm going to turn it over to Deputy Secretary Kenny, and I'll ask you about a program that you developed, that the Iowa Department of Ag developed, called the Local Produce and Protein Program. If you can talk a little bit about how that was developed through the CARES Act funding, how it helped Iowa schools and Iowa farmers, and why you decided to focus on investing in your K through 12 schools and farm to school.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Lisa, for the question. Well, farm to school has been a really important part of the department and at the state since our legislature authorized it in 2007. So we have always looked for ways to, how do we incentivize, how do we de-risk, how do we connect the right people to help connect our producers with schools, help students learn more about the food that's grown, and really establish these local food systems. So it's always been important. It was probably emphasized even more heavily when our farmers were faced with such challenges this spring and summer. Both specialty crop producers, on the produce side of things, but also, meat and dairy and eggs and things like that are also really important part of school lunch. K through 12, but also early childhood, university settings, all kinds of school settings are important. So what we quickly built was a grant program that can do just that. So how do we expand our farm to school program given some of the challenges that we were facing? So there were really three arms of this program. The first was to enable K through 12 schools to purchase equipment and supplies and things like that to help facilitate more of these purchases through their schools. So again, all about trying to de-risk it, all about trying to help them make those local connections so that once we're through all of this, hopefully those relationships can prosper and grow beyond that, and that we've created a foundation that we need. So again, the first one was equipment and supplies for K through 12 schools. The next one was grant funding to help them actually purchase some of these produce, meat, dairy, and eggs from local producers. And then the third component of this was more on the farmer and the producer side of things, where they could also purchase equipment and supplies needed for these specific markets and distribution channels. And so it's been wildly successful. Our farm to school program is always successful, but we're hearing from the participants, especially first time participants this year, that for every dollar that we put in, the schools would match $1. So we saw, buy-in at the school level. We think the foundation has been set to expand that program even further once we get out of COVID times, and really help, again, meet the needs of those producers and every kind of producer. It can be conventional producers, it can be organic, it can be whatever kind of production method the producer has chosen to enlist in, and that meets the needs of those schools, K through 12, early childhood, or university settings. So the governor was kind enough to allocate $750,000 for that program. We have really strong interest in it and have worked to implement that since it was launched back late last spring, early summer. So again, really successful and something we'll look to build upon in years to come.
Oh, that's awesome. That's exciting work. And I will now turn it over to Commissioner Greenberg to talk to us a little bit about the meat industry. Livestock's a huge industry in Colorado. And can you share a little bit about how COVID impacted meat processing and what you guys did to kind of look at inspections and helping facilitate that, ways you were able to invest in that sector, and also what policies, funding, and other factors were valuable in that process? So as you were identifying those needs and addressing those, what were some of those policies that you tagged into?
Well, this has been a big one for us, and like many other states. And of course, the cow-calf, cattle industry here in Colorado is our leading ag industry. So we are a cattle state. And that's true, not just because of our private lands, but our substantial public lands that are used in part for agriculture. So when we saw the impacts from COVID start rippling through other states in terms of supply chain backups and breakdowns, we, in some ways, just because of our geography, had a little bit of a head start. I mean, on the produce side, just as a side note, right, the southern states really struggled last March in a way that we had a little bit of extra time. We weren't in harvest, we were in planting season when COVID hit. We didn't have to deal with the question of what to do with a harvest when all of a sudden your markets have shut down almost overnight, and retail and food service sales have plummeted and everybody's going to the grocery store. We of course felt that impact though here, and particularly in the processing side, we have a number of processors around the state, but we have two very large ones, which of course struggle just like everyone across the country with how do you keep workers safe? How do you keep the food system going? We're critical business, critical infrastructure, but that doesn't mean we're immune from this virus by any means. So, from day one, we've been working with our processors, large and small, across the state to understand what barriers they've been facing. In the early months, it was just a 7-day-a-week hustle, really, just to get PPE, to get guidance, to get resources for how on earth do you address this as a business, as a worker, what are your resources to keep yourself and your family safe? And how do we also message to consumers that we still have a safe and secure food supply, even though we're dealing with the ripple effects of a global pandemic? And that was a big part of it, because Colorado does and has always had a safe and secure food supply throughout this whole pandemic, but that wasn't a given. That was because our community came together and worked, again, day and night to make sure that things stayed open, and we figured out how to move through this. So tangibly speaking, when we saw some of the backups and bottlenecks in the larger facilities, that really pushed demand for processing down to the smaller and mid-scale processors around the state, who just were immediately overwhelmed with demand. I mean, a lot of them were already scheduling, many months in advance. Now, most processors, I mean, you can't get in most places 12, 18 months, even longer than that. That doesn't work for most people's business models, right? I mean, you've got to have a place to process if you're going to have a product for market. At the same time, we saw, shifting consumer demand, at least anecdotally to date, Although our amazing team, I got to give a shout out, Don Thilmany and Becca Jablonski with CSU, has worked with Kentucky team and others to do the consumer assessments of how have consumer behaviors changed throughout COVID. Certainly anecdotally, we were seeing so much, just a spike in demand for local. Folks wanted to know where their food came from, wanted to have that relationship. And we saw that on the beef side as well. Producers, I was talking to the cattlemen's president not long ago. We were out on the range, actually, in her rangeland in Western Colorado. She was telling me that she had plans for a direct-to-consumer marketing for the whole summer, spring and summer of 2020. She moved her entire inventory in a weekend. Just phenomenal demand. And of course, a lot of what we're focusing now is how can we capitalize on that demand. These local and regional food systems are typically higher value for producers, and they're higher value for consumers in my mind as well. So if we can help on that processing piece by directing resources to scale distributed, independent, rural businesses that help really drive these new sectors of the ag economy, then we're going to get more business solidified for Colorado ag. So lastly, on that point, there are a lot of things in the works to make this happen at the middle. Our focus initially with the CARES Act dollars were for processing. That was to help fill a gap in federal aid. Again, we supported 15 processors across the state to help increase their capacity. We know capital is a huge barrier and workforce is a huge barrier. So those are places we've got our sights set. When it comes to inspection, per your question, Lisa, we did a ton of stakeholder work to understand, we don't have a state inspection program here, so we rely on FSIS, but we had a lot of discussions of, would state inspection help solve the issues? Would it create more issues? How would we fund it? What other tools in the toolbox do we have to help alleviate some of this pressure that's now been placed on the local and regional systems at the processing scale to open up that opportunity for new marketing and new business? And that's the direction we're heading now, really focusing on capital, focusing on workforce, and supporting those end buyers who will really help drive the rest of that local and regional supply chain.
Great, thank you. I'm going to now turn it over to Liz. So Liz, how is your community able to leverage COVID response initiatives at the federal level, state level, or philanthropic funding that's available at the local level? What were those gaps that you hope to fill with the work that you were doing? And how were you positioned with your networks to really go after that and help some vulnerable communities that were facing incredible need?
So one of the things that was unique to our position is that the gaps that I like to say COVID turned the lights on and accelerated were the gaps we had been working on forever. I worked in public health for a while and I understood brick and mortar development, but we've been working on teaching the state about health disparities that were food related, preventable diseases forever. So we knew what was coming. And one of the things that we've always done is sort of, as we called for change, we presented solutions. So 10 years ago, we knew that kids needed access to more fresh produce. The Food Policy Council helped our district write a USDA grant. And because we helped write it, we insisted that part of that grant be used to put salad bars in schools. Both Sodexo, our food service provider, and the school district were resistant. They said kids won't eat produce, and we said yes, they would, and I'll prove it to you because we will help grow our school garden program. And when I said that, that said, you provide the supplies and I'll put in the gardens and teach the lessons and you don't have to pay me. Not to romanticize this work, but sometimes that's just what you have to do. You have to show up and make it easy. We had 4 school gardens in and now we have 29. So when we saw COVID coming, we knew schools were going to close. A friend who's a farmer, World Farmers, they represent 300 farmers of color in Central Mass, decided she was going to apply for the Farmers to Families boxes. I didn't think she'd get it, but we worked on that application. Surprisingly, she got it. It wasn't enough money, but we were able to bring in Sodexo in the school district because I said we can bring a box of fresh produce for 400 families, 400 to 450 families every week. Can you receive the produce, Sodexo, and then take it to the school meal distribution sites? And they did. And families took that produce, and then local philanthropic community who were directing all their money to emergency food and historically had not funded groups of color, were under a lot of pressure to fund groups of color because we were experiencing these things at higher rates. And that was directly linked to those earlier things we talked about. So they gave me lots of money and we fed people all the way through the growing season. It was great for farmers because they weren't able to go to market. And it was great for families. We had kids in Springfield eating blueberries that had never had them. It was great for the Food Policy Council because we were able to talk about working upstream. We also put backyard gardens in. So because we got this money thrown at us, we lived out every dream that we'd had and bought tons of soil, put it on the tree belt, learned how to build boxes and put gardens in like 5 weeks for 58 families. So I think though, it was really, I don't think I know, it was built on years and years of relationships. And sometimes those relationships start out as sort of tokenism. Of course, just being a Black person in my state, there were no other Black people leading Food Policy Council work and very few people in the food system, period. So understanding policy at the federal, state, and local levels, I had gone to Washington around the last Farm Bill to advocate specifically for school food and the retention of SNAP. And I was really lucky because I tried to read the Farm Bill, which was crazy. I had no idea. And then friends were like, no, you'll still be reading in the time the next Farm Bill comes up. But people gave me briefs and they taught me lots of stuff. And the Union of Concerned Scientists supported that work, which then made me start thinking about EJ work because I understood that Springfield was the asthma capital of the country and what was the correlation between these disconnects. And shouldn't we be talking about environmental justice at the same time that we were talking about food justice? So COVID for us, just as it accelerated all the very bad things, it accelerated the good things. So I encourage folks, because we're still in it, right? And we've got to make the best of it because we're experiencing it as well as our communities, to dream big and ask for what you want. Because now, particularly if you are of the BIPOC community, it's harder for folks to say no. It's harder to say that won't work because especially when you have folks at high levels in the government saying, and we were able to advance these things. So figuring out how to replicate those things on the local level, I think, is what's really, really key.
Thank you, Liz. That was very inspiring. It makes me feel good. I want to dream big. All right, I've got my eyes looking at some good big ideas. I'm going to turn now to Lalani to dig a little bit more into policy. So are there any policy best practices you saw emerge around the COVID response for the local and regional food systems specifically? Things that you saw come out of all this incredible need and this innovation that's happening at the local and the state level?
Sure. First, can everybody hear me okay? I want to make sure I'm not breaking up. Okay, awesome. So yeah, I just want to say, like what Liz was saying, it's something I've been thinking about a lot in terms of the relationship building piece, because I can talk about policy and I'll give examples, but it does seem like one thing we've learned throughout this crisis is the importance of relationships, and those relationships that were already established before allowed policy or programs and everything to happen more quickly. So you can think about policy and specific strategies, but policy doesn't exist without people who have relationships with each other, with the community. So just keep that in mind as I give examples. And so, yeah, I'll talk about some things that we've been seeing, but I will say that they come from different sources. Some are like research projects that we work on. I'll share links in the chat, but they come from different places. One website that I'll put in the chat too, that's not my own work, that I will be sharing stuff that I found there, is the State Innovation Exchange website. If you haven't checked it out, I'll put the link in. They've got some really great resources, specifically for state policy related to COVID and food systems. So I would say one area that we've seen is innovation in policies that are supporting local food infrastructure and systems in local food systems. And one specific policy that I'm sure everybody has heard of, but a lot of states deemed farmers markets as essential services. Some states at the beginning didn't, and that was really hard. But at this point, I think a lot of states have done that. But that is something that we saw, variation across the states, where it seemed to me like a no-brainer that farmers markets should be considered an essential service. And a lot comes with that in terms of how they were able to operate and keep going during the pandemic. One other thing that I bet a lot of us have thought about too is the lack of federal guidance that made it really hard for states and for farmers markets in particular, there wasn't much guidance for things like masks. Can you, like, how do you make sure people at your markets are being safe if you're having to operate? And can you require people to wear masks or not? And can you enforce a mask policy if you have one? So those are things that we were looking into over the past few months. We just created a new resource. I'll share the link that clarifies ways that markets can create their own mask policies that also allow them to comply with the ADA, because that's where some challenges were coming up. People were worried that they wouldn't be able to comply with the ADA, and people who have pre-existing conditions and disabilities. So that's something that we saw come up. Another policy that we were seeing is states that were providing opportunities for increased local meat infrastructure and meat processing, and we heard a little bit about that today, but states such as Oregon and North Carolina and New Mexico, among others, were working on bills that bolster meat production to small and independent farmers. And some, I can't remember, I'll have to send the exact ones, but mobile meat processing is something that we've seen people focus on too, to help, you know, because that's a very centralized big meat processing facilities. Looking at the local food systems, there are needs to have that at a smaller scale. Also creating there's a couple states, New York and Utah, both created working groups to assess food security and local food supply to bolster their own community resilience. So that's something that a state could do and that we thought was great. There's a lot of, like I mentioned before, appropriating additional funding to farmers, and we've heard that today on our panel as well. You can do that in a lot of different ways. Some states like New York included small and independent farmers and any other small business aid in their state, which I think that's a great idea. For farm and food workers in particular, some states appropriated funds for farmers to purchase more PPE for their workers. New Jersey did that. And a lot of states are doing this more in relation to farm workers and accessibility of information. They're ensuring that all information is communicated in Spanish and English. Vermont did that, and there's a bill in California to make sure that all workers, regardless of the primary language that they speak, can access that important information. And one other, I could go on forever, but I'll give another example. California, Governor Newsom required in an executive order paid sick leave for workers, which is crucial. Like, if you don't have paid sick leave for workers, it's really hard to try to keep, you know, keep everybody safe during something like COVID. There's a bunch that has happened, I will say, for local procurement and school meal support and farm to school programs. We've heard a little bit about that, but one last policy that I'm going to bring up is universal school meals, which we've seen a lot of over the past decade. And if you haven't heard of it, this is something that farm to school advocates are looking toward as a strategy to advance farm to school goals, but also just allowing access to food for children generally, not just local food. And it means that all students enrolled in participating in like public schools are given, that get free meals regardless of their income eligibility in the federal meal program. So a lot of states have done this. I'll share a resource that has some examples. There's also movement for universal pre-K, which is awesome. A few bills have come up over the past year. Mississippi had one, North Carolina as well. Unfortunately, I think most of those are dead bills, but that has just been the case with COVID. A lot of bills have come up and then have not been able to move forward because of the situation that we're in. There isn't money right now to do those programs, but it's still really exciting to see them happening. So that's just a sample. I'll give some links and resources, but there's so much going on. It's really exciting to see the innovation that's happening across the country. I'll hand it back over to Lisa now.
Thanks, Leilani. Well, so we're going to change focus a little bit. So a lot of folks have mentioned, Leilani mentioned it, Liz mentioned it, a lot of other folks, the commissioner mentioned it, that networks have been critical in this time of need. And so what we're going to look now at, what we're going to explore is the role of collaboration, public-private partnerships, in helping us to adapt and address the needs that came through COVID, and really exposing a lot of needs that we already had that COVID just have now kind of put a spotlight on. So I'm going to turn things over to Liz. You mentioned before that you saw yourself as a community organizer, bringing people together. So there's likely people listening today who are working in government or other large institutions who are interested in building bridges with historically marginalized and underserved communities of all kinds, but they feel overwhelmed and maybe not sure where to start. From your perspective, what kinds of relationships or partnerships can be transformative for community food systems, and where do you start?
So this is a big one, right? Like you could do a whole series on that. It's a big elephant and you have to pick your piece to chew on. But before I jump into that, I just want to make sure that everyone understands that our work is from a policy systems and environmental change framework. So everything that I mentioned we did has become a policy initiative, because I'm like, you know, one of those little nippy dogs, and I will chew on you like you're a bone until I get what I want, but that's not sustainable. So we spend a lot of time teaching residents what policy is, both local legislative policy, city council, and statewide policy. We have salad bars in every school, and that's built into our wellness policy. And I made it very clear that it was our goal to make that policy as healthy and as it could possibly be. We say that if anyone's going to bid on our food service contract, they have to be committed to maintaining that and to maintaining school gardens and continuing to implement them until we have them in every single school. So everything has a policy connection. With the universal free meals, so the folks who are hunger people, and I guess we all are, that meant that our hunger visits to the nurses, when we implemented that at the local level, were reduced by 90%. So instead of having an average of 1,500 student visits to the school nurse across our district every day, that went down to under 300 in the first 6 months. That's enough to move you. But what it really did was increase the ability to have participation rates, which put more money into the system because we could ask for reimbursement for more meals. And that then made them build a culinary nutrition center that cost $22 million, where we make our own sauce from scratch using ugly tomatoes from the farmers that I built these long relationships with. So to get to the relationship piece, you know, someone asked me recently, what's the difference between diversity and tokenism? And I think, unfortunately, it always feels like tokenism, both for the people of color, for the BIPOC folks, and for everybody who doesn't know, BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And we're using that language specifically because the experience of being Black and Indigenous in the United States is different from that of other people of color, both in terms of length and the deep sort of saturation of systemic racism. But I will show up whether it feels like tokenism or not, if I know I'm not just there because I bring the color. If my value in the food system is really evident beyond the fact that I'm Black, that needs to be the gravy. I understand school food, I understand policy, I know how to talk to legislators, I know how to talk to commissioners, whether they're public health commissioners or ag commissioners. And I've helped them, I believe, to begin to think about how they talk with each other. And so I say very much in the I, but now we have a whole community of advocates that look like everybody in Massachusetts who has seen that the worst thing that's going to happen is that folks are going to roll their eyes the first 20 times you talk. Then they're going to start to see, here's my role. So now I have people calling me up saying, I have meat that I can't move. Can you help me? Well, you know, I thought about buying 40 freezers and putting them in my garage, but we have a culinary nutrition center now. Who knew that I was going to need a place for storage? And the district gets most of the credit. And so you have to be willing to keep your eye focused on the goal. Every piece of press talked about how the district was sending fresh produce home with families, how the district was helping kids to get backyard gardens. And that makes fundraising really hard, but ultimately I'm getting every single thing I want and things I didn't even dream of. But you've got to really understand the value that community brings, particularly if you are in positions of elected, if you have elected positions or if you're commissioners. You want a constituency that's going to support your work and the things you care about. So it's long relationship building. This is a 10-year, 11-year relationship that we've built across the state, we being the Food Policy Council. And we've worked really hard to help parents and residents and seniors understand how they can show up and speak out and bring testimony. We've also helped city department heads understand that their jobs get better when they're not just responding in terms of snowstorms, when they are able, from a Parks and Rec perspective, to think about converting something to a community garden because it impacts them financially. It's one less place to think about. So from the community end, you know, the work is still really hard on our side. We always have to be coming with a solution to the problem that we're presenting. And those of you who have the power to listen, you've got to listen. I had to tell our Department of Transitional Assistant Commissioner when he yelled at me about race that I don't work for him, he works for me. And I understand that. And I think it's important for commissioners to understand and internalize that, and for communities to internalize it, not because we want to beat them up, but we want everybody to come together. And everybody needs to be advocating for pandemic EBT cards. If you are a community eligible community, that means every single kid in your community can get a pandemic EBT card. And if your state is not advancing it, you better be in touch with me and I will figure out a way to help you about any of this.
Liz is awesome. I would encourage you to reach out to her if any of this is sparking interest or you want to learn more. I will now turn over to Commissioner Greenberg. So in your role as the Commissioner of Agriculture, what are some of those relationships and collaborations that you found to be most valuable for you during the pandemic? And what advice would you give to other states or communities looking to you to kind of give them some guidance? What would you say would be the way to go?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think to Liz's point, so many of these relationships we were building these long before the pandemic hit. And, you know, it's not like that's our last chance. We're always building relationships. We're always asking, you know, how can we do better? I actually think that's a moment we're in right now. We've been so blinders on, emergency response, stem the bleeding, support our communities, advocate here, you know, get resources moved over there. But there comes a moment where we have to step back and say, okay, we've been doing this work 7 days a week for almost a year. What are we missing? Who are we missing? Where do we need to strengthen? So that's just the backstop to say we're never done, and we can't take for granted that the relationships we've built to date are strong enough to withstand whatever's coming down the pike. We've got to keep reinvesting in them. And I'd say one example, which I think we talked about a little bit, you know, farmers markets, for example. Our state, we did designate farmers markets as part of critical retail, but that didn't mean each of our 64 counties saw them in the same way. And so part of our out the gates, our role was to actually be a liaison with our local governments. Of course, there's tons of infrastructure for how the state Department of Health and the local public health agencies interact. But we, on the ag community side, really, you know, I reached out to all of our local public health agencies through the network and said, you guys are dealing with unprecedented moment. We want to help you support our farmers and ranchers and food and ag businesses. Please call on us to do that. And that was really incredible out the gates. We were able to work with counties who are really nervous about farmers markets, because farmers markets are where you gather, there's people packed in front of booths. How on earth can you do that with social distancing? And their liability as public health was real. So we worked with them to support, you know, how they manage risk for the population, and then how do we keep business open? And we had a lot of success in that sort of relationship. The Colorado Farm and Food System Respond and Rebuild Fund, which I've mentioned a few times, you know, that started as just a conversation saying, hey, with one philanthropy organization saying, we don't have money yet, but we're already seeing the bleeding. How can we organize to get resources? That relationship just blossomed into what the team was able to build, which has been a really remarkable infrastructure. You know, in addition to that, we've been asking ourselves and also leaning on community members who have been leading on this. How do we actually reach our food and ag worker community in a way that's not just the state rolling in and putting a bunch of regulations on people? Because that's not how we want to roll as a Department of Ag. We know that public health has a whole nother suite of responsibilities, but anything that we can do to make this community driven, to have buy-in, to support the local networks that we have in Colorado, and is so true across the country. We want to lean on that. So we have a number of folks here, particularly from an organization called Frontline Farming in Denver. That's part of Farmers Union and Young Farmers Coalition, and a great network of organizers. They worked with the Department of Human Services, which is where all of our food access work here in Colorado lives. They built what is called a Promotoras program. So they have, I think, over 70 regional advocates around the state who advocate for public health within the farm and ag worker communities, so that we are thinking about culturally and linguistically appropriate outreach. We're thinking about how do we overcome the barriers of trust as a state that's now responding to a crisis. Trust remains the foundation, and we can't risk breaking that just because everything's so urgent. So really leaning on those new relationships, I think that's really new for the department to really think about how can we better serve our food and ag workers across the food and ag supply chain. And I hope that's something that we really build on even as we emerge from the pandemic.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to turn now to Deputy Secretary Kinney in Iowa, and still we're going to explore some more about networks. So one of the findings that came through this project was that communities with existing networks for local food initiatives and ongoing collaborations were really well positioned to be able to pivot into response when COVID had major disruptions to markets, and to make short-term investments that will hopefully support long-term vitality in the local food sector. So what are some insights you can share on some of the key ingredients for success as you're working with existing networks or trying to grow out networks to really deal with this challenge that we've had over the past year?
Great question. And I think Commissioner Greenberg handled part of this really well, in that these networks weren't new. They existed before the pandemic, but I think probably similar to her experience, ours became absolutely critical in the midst of responding and trying to figure out, how do we respond and how do we recover coming out of some of this. And so maybe just a couple examples. I mentioned earlier, the governor created a Feeding Iowans Task Force, and that has been so incredibly helpful to help deal with challenges as a result of the pandemic. It includes every state agency that touches any kind of feeding activity. So Human Services, Department of Education, of course, Department of Agriculture, but also, food banks, our University Extension Service, local community advocates who are very interested and engaged in this work and have relationships that those of us in state government maybe do not. And so we were initially meeting weekly, and our challenge was really to identify issues right away and find solutions and implement them. It was and has been very successful. I think, to get to your point, Lisa, on how do we extend these networks for the benefit going forward, we saw that in the state specifically when we were faced with a derecho in August. And so for those of you outside of Iowa who maybe didn't hear about that, it didn't hit a lot of the national news. It was essentially a land hurricane that impacted a third of the crop acres in the state of Iowa. So when you think about agriculture production and all of the crops that we grow, traditional corn and soybeans, but also specialty crops and orchards, and all kinds of things, it was devastating. It was devastating from an agriculture side of things, and it was also devastating because people did not have electricity, they did not have access to food. It was an emergency on top of an emergency that we were all dealing with the pandemic. And part of the reason I bring that up is because the foundation that was set through that Feeding Iowans Task Force, we had networked so incredibly well in the months leading up to that as soon as the derecho hit, we were already mobilized. We already knew each other. We already knew the strengths and the opportunities for improvement within every single organization and locally. So immediately we were on the ground trying to identify ways to help residents who were impacted get through the emergency, help farmers who were impacted. And we saw the fruits of that work right away on August 10th when we faced that derecho. So I think the learning for us from a state perspective is we have to continue to foster those relationships. While we were meeting weekly, through initial stages of the pandemic. We have to find a way to continue those because we don't know what we'll be faced with, next year or the year after, and make sure that we've got resources on the ground to deal with some of those challenges. From a Department of Agriculture, perspective, our Secretary Nag, immediately as soon as the pandemic hit, was meeting weekly with different stakeholder groups. We had a livestock stakeholder group that would meet on Mondays, and it was an opportunity to share what are the on the ground kind of challenges that we're facing. And then it was immediately, how do we go out and deal with some of those challenges? So we had a livestock one and we had a crop one, and we continue to meet with those stakeholders. It's not weekly anymore, it's monthly, but those relationships are built. So as soon as there's a challenge, we're all mobilized, ready and ready to respond to that. So can't emphasize enough how important networking is and relying on those who have the expertise and the resources to make a difference on the ground.
Awesome, thank you so much. Okay, so I'm gonna take it over to Leilani. Can you talk to us a little bit about what other initiatives you've seen across the country that have been effective in leveraging policy in creative ways during the COVID pandemic that bring together local food systems and community food security, maybe things that are addressing larger issues in our food systems?
Sure. Yeah. So one policy that I saw recently that I thought was really great was in Minnesota. There was a policy where they appropriated $6 million to the Commissioner of Ag to grant to nonprofit boards to purchase food for distribution to individuals and families that are in need. And they said that 50% of that had to be for Minnesota producers and processors that were negatively impacted by COVID. So I thought that was just an interesting approach to specifying that it needs to benefit the local food system within that state. I have another example that isn't state level, but I thought it was super interesting, and that's in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was encouraging urban ag and local food production, and they passed a resolution that recognized that urban farming would help Pittsburgh neighborhoods recover from the global pandemic and insulate communities against the impact of future crises. And it authorized and directed directors of the Department of Finance and City Planning to create incentives to encourage and empower residents to create and maintain urban ag sites. And some of these incentives included waiving fees, eliminating certain program requirements or restrictions for city-sponsored programs. So I thought that was a great example of something that could be done and doesn't have to just be done during COVID. That could be something where a city shows its support for urban ag and community gardening for the long term, to put their money where their mouth is. Just waiving some of those fees could make a big difference for people. A few other examples, and Liz brought up PEBT, and I feel like that's something where, in terms of SNAP and PEBT, like states have a certain amount of flexibility when it comes to implementing those programs. And we saw some states increase benefits to reach some immediate needs that they were seeing in their states, or do pilots. The online purchasing program is new, and there are states that are doing that. And I can't emphasize enough, I think, the importance to think about like why that can't happen. Why can't there be online purchasing for people who have SNAP? Why can't we make that work? I think it can be done, and there are states that are trying to do that. Especially right now, it seems like it's a no-brainer. It's not easy, but we're seeing it be done. It's one of those things where before the pandemic, it was like, this could never happen. Like, there's no way there could be online SNAP. And now we're seeing, we could make this work. So it's something to think about. And with the PEBT, pandemic EBT, like Liz was saying, that is to help families who would have otherwise received the free school meals before COVID. And there are some states that are approved to do that now. My understanding is that last year, for the remainder of that school year, states all ended up getting approval, but it's been tricky to get continued approval and rolling that out. And that's something that I think if your state hasn't looked into that, you should absolutely look into doing that. A few more ideas or models for local food procurement at the state level. This is another piece of the project that we're working on with the National Farm to School Network, is looking at new policies over the past couple of years that have emerged. So I'm going to say a few things that we found now, but the full report's going to be published in June, around June 2021 or so. But we've seen there seems to be like 3 models for doing this at the state level. One is incentivizing to reach a certain threshold, and New York has done that. Some other states are doing a cent match reimbursement for local products. And I think Michigan and Oregon and DC have tried that out. And then there's another model for this, which is a lump sum reimbursement with an application, and New Mexico has done that. And so there's different ways to incentivize at the state level, local food procurement. They have pros and cons. We'll be analyzing them in more detail, but it's something to think about going forward. And just one last topic area that I would encourage you to think about for food recovery, communities have been doing a lot of work cleaning and trying to get food that is otherwise going to be tossed out to people that need it. And you can use state policy to support that work. You can provide liability protections for food banks and agricultural donors or gleaners. And you can encourage the distribution of surplus food in those ways. Some states have allowed nonprofit organizations to redistribute donated food directly to schools, or have instituted a tax credit to encourage agricultural producers to donate their extra produce to local food banks. So that's something that I think is worth looking into as well. So those are just some examples I've been thinking about that not many were mentioned during the panel today. So that's some food for thought.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, and with that, we're going to shift a little bit to looking forward. So we've all had a really rough year in trying to navigate some unusual challenges, but what's coming down the pike? So we're going to look at how do we carry the lessons we've learned into the future, into this new administration. So Leilani, you're on the hook again. I've got a question for you again. So we're moving into a new administration. Are there any policy or funding initiatives that you'll be paying particular attention to for the local and regional food systems, so coming up on the horizon? And what do you think may shape the local and regional food system in the near term, next couple of years?
Yeah, sure. So we're super hopeful with the new administration. It seems like they've emphasized goals around climate and racial equity, and also supporting rural communities and rural families. So I feel like there's a lot that is going to happen. I'm feeling personally hopeful about that. I just want to say one thing that we look at all the time when we're thinking bigger picture is the Farm Bill, which I think Liz mentioned that, but you can't ignore it forever. It's huge. It includes everything, food and ag. So it's every 5 years or so. And if you're unfamiliar, it really includes everything from like commodity programs to conservation programs and SNAP and crop insurance and farm loans, rural development, energy, the list goes on. There's a lot that is in there. So that's one thing that we're looking forward to and focusing on. And CAS, where I work, we're part of this consortium of law schools that focuses on the Farm Bill. It's called FABLE, FBLE. And the idea of this group is to try to shift the thinking from these like 5-year increments of like what's going to happen in this 5 years to like try to think bigger picture about addressing long-term needs of society, like economic opportunity and stability and public health and nutrition and natural resources and the environment and fair access, equal protection for people. So that the goal of that group is to use the Farm Bill to do more than what it traditionally has been. And so we're putting together some recommendations. And I was just talking to my colleague who is like more deeply in the weeds on this. And the piece that CAFS is going to be working on is putting together proposals, building off of and trying to complement the Justice for Black Farmers Act, which if you haven't seen it, I'll put a link in. It's really great. I think Cory Booker and Elizabeth Warren put it out. But thinking about racial equity in the food system and trying to build off the work that they've done. And that proposal is a focus that we'll be having. And it seems like this administration is like ready to do something about that. So we're feeling pretty hopeful in that sense. So yeah, I would say Farm Bill is something. If you haven't thought much about it or looked at it, it's something to learn about. And another, just one piece of thought in terms of federal level and future of our country, we also have been talking a lot about the need for a national food strategy, and recently put out a report that calls for a US national food strategy to have a more coordinated federal approach to food and ag law and policy. Kind of gets to the same issue I was talking about with the Farm Bill. It's really fragmented. It's here and there over the course of different years, and different administrations can do different things. But we really would love to see during this administration a focus and maybe creating a national food strategy to kind of reduce inefficiencies that exist and also accomplish the goals that they say they want to do. Because right now there's 15 agencies that implement like over 30 different statutes to regulate and oversee the food system. And it's complicated. There's a lot of overlapping things. It's hard to like see clearly how to accomplish the goals that we all want in federal policy. So that's something that, you know, it's all, like I said, it's all related. What happens at the federal level then dictates what can happen at the state level and local level. So there is something to be said for like these big changes, if they can happen, it will be really great, I think, to support local food systems, because there could be more grant funding, you know, that come down through all of the programs that we know about, like the local food promotion program and the farmers market promotion program and the farm to school grants. Like those are all areas that I am really hoping continue to be built out. If we want to support local food systems, we have to keep building those programs out.
Well, Lonnie, just I'm chiming in from the chat. Can you restate the name of the group leading the Farm Bill planning effort?
Yep. So it's called the Farm Bill Law Consortium, FBLE. I have a link to the website. I'll put it in the chat. It's a group of law schools that are working on it.
Thanks so much. Okay, back to Lisa.
Sounds like somebody got it there. Great. Yeah, happy to answer any questions, but I'll hand it back over to Lisa.
Great. And if we have questions, just put them in the chat, and Lillian is monitoring that, so I'll make sure that your questions get answered throughout. Thanks, Alani. I'm going to move over to Liz. So Liz, this has been an awful tough year. And so we've seen a lot of upheaval. There's been a lot of grief, horrible impacts to families and communities. But what gives you hope for the local food system? What are some of the examples of ingenuity, resilience, or fellowship that you hope to build on as you move forward, that give you inspiration? I think maybe just a little bit of a glimmer of happiness and potential here would really help us kind of get over this next hump.
You're on mute, Liz.
I'd love to bring the light. I'm not sure completely what it is. Hope on the community side doesn't change. People ask me, are you optimistic? And that varies from day to day, but I'm always incredibly hopeful, because COVID has caused us to consider the conversation around equity differently, I believe. And not from a, oh, we need to go help those poor people, but well, those poor people have some ideas that are potentially replicable not only across the state, but across the country. And the ideas that we have forwarded have benefited farmers, white male farmers in the state of Massachusetts who didn't think they needed to ever talk to me. So I think that people are bringing I have a mentor, his name is Dr. Frank Robinson. He's a public health wonk and a VP in our local hospital. And he talks about this work that we do being head, hands, and heart work. And we're all like heads people, but I saw some pictures of folks, and there are a couple on here who I recognize who are also hands. They grow food. And many of us have been bringing our heart to it. But I encourage folks, particularly around policy, to go after the head and the heart, and then worry about the pockets after. We asked for universal free breakfast and lunch in our state and got it because we didn't ask for money. I knew we were going to need money. I feared that we would be left with the same federal administration that we had, and I knew they'd come after school food because that's just the trajectory we were on. And so I got to know folks at SNAP and SNAP Ed. They can't advocate. This is the other reason that all of you need good community relationships, because we can have advocacy, not lobbying, but advocacy conversations that the rest of you can't have. We can talk to our US legislators on a local level and help them understand the impacts of the Farm Bill. And there's amazing resources for us to learn. You know, policy are just the rules. So we need to not be afraid of it. And that I'm hopeful for, because we recognize that if our voices aren't there, the policy is not going to be good. And it's also the horror of, so Black men have been dying. I'm raising a big little Black boy and I'm married to a Black man. I'm afraid every single day. I'm more afraid now because of what happened on the 6th. But that fear has always been there, but I've not let it paralyze me. I have worked to understand issues around community policing. I've worked to get police to come and work in school gardens. I want them to know the children. In communities, there's this, or in policing, it's like they were known to the police. Well, I want all my kids in this town to be known to the police as people and as human beings. And I want to be known to my the legislature, and both at the state level, and I want us to be known at the US level as active, engaged participants. We are not just waiting for things to get done. We're all ready to show up with you. And I want you to be ready to show up with us. I want folks to be able to tell the truth about race and to recognize that there's, you're either racist or you're anti-racist. That's really hard to hear. But if you are not working every day to consider, particularly as a person of European descent, what am I bringing to my work? Which means, what am I bringing to the world? What do I really think? The goal can't be to not see color. The goal has to be to pay attention to what we think and feel when we see color. So if anything, I think this moment we're in gives us an opportunity to consider that. And we have to consider it as individuals. You can't talk about changing government. You can't talk about changing your agencies if you don't recognize it in yourself. But, so what? Either we do that or we live in this strife and just dehumanity that we've all been living in, because white people lose their humanity because of systemic racism. As soon as we made that transaction that said we can remove Indigenous people from their land, as soon as you made the transaction that said, or those you descend from, that said, it's okay to go enslave these other people, as soon as those who came more recently made the transaction to give up who they were culturally to be white, bits and pieces of us get stripped away in the same way that George Floyd's humanity was stripped away by that police officer's knee on his neck. I can't sit in the pain of that. I have to be fueled by it. So we have to be fueled by the pain of this pandemic. We have to decide we are going to be better prepared for whatever comes, because I pray every day that we don't have this. But some of you live in states where you will have disasters that will happen. Think about the resiliency you've learned from this major thing and be really proactive. And what do we do when a blizzard hits, as is happening for Julie? And how are we making sure that food is still transported to the most marginalized people? What have we learned from this? So that's really where I have my hope. And then you're all younger than I am, but there are some people who are not. And you work for people who are my age. Ask them how many times they got to sit, even in a Zoom, but in a room with very young white people and emerging elders like myself. I'm trying to lean into the dignity of that, who can outwork most of the young people I know and have real conversations, right? So that is really where I put my hope and my head and my heart and my hands, and I'm calling you in to do that with me. And don't tell me I'm inspiring. Just go do something.
I was going to say it, but I take it back. Well, you are as you're instructed.
We are all inspiring, right? This is crappy, 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 but we are built for it. Women hold up the world. Read Jada Pinkett Smith's book. Girls hold up the world. We hold it up. And we fix the messes that men make. And I know some really amazing men, but seriously, like, have a paradigm shift about what we bring to this really big, horrible monster.
Yes, because there's so much work to be done and we are equipped to do it. And I appreciate that so much because sometimes it can feel, I'll just say personally, overwhelming and feeling like there's too much need and not enough figuring it out. And so we've got some tools, we've got a lot of hands to help us. So I appreciate that, remembering that we're all in this together and we can overcome. All right, I'm going to regroup a little bit. I'm going to turn it to Deputy Secretary Kinney. So we're trying to talk about local food systems. They're really tricky to talk about because they include just about everything. And they're very diverse in terms of market channels, stakeholders, and everything. And kitchen sink can be included in local food systems. So what have you learned from how other states have addressed local and regional food systems? And what strategies have you picked up from other places to address COVID? And do you see any consensus in how people are developing best practices and kind of working in concert, either with other states or other regions, as they try to address this huge looming problem?
Thanks for the question, Lisa. I think it's important, as a State Department of Agriculture to understand the unique needs and challenges of our states, but I think we also have a responsibility to understand what's happening in other states and what can we learn from it. And I think NASDA is especially effective at helping to make some of those connections. What works for us in Iowa, Secretary Neg and our constituents may not work in Colorado for Commissioner Greenberg, but you've heard her talk about meat processing and how that's so incredibly important. Guess what? It is in Iowa too, and every state in between. And so as we look at some of the unique challenges that we faced over the last year, I think it's an opportunity for us to find some commonality, learn from what others have done. So we're not, building it from the ground up every single time that we need to, but also embracing that we are unique and have unique challenges. Our states are different. Even within our state, what's needed in Des Moines is very different than in our rural communities that don't have a lot of the benefits that some of our urban areas do. And so I think, from our perspective, it's all about embracing, from a producer standpoint and a farmer perspective, different types of growing methods, different sizes of farms, different types of market distributions, different types of end consumers and markets that they're going after, just like consumers have different preferences and are looking for different things. We certainly have seen a growing movement toward local foods, especially in the state here. People want to know where their food is grown. And in such an agriculture state like Iowa, they should know where and how their food is grown, and they should know a farmer. And so trying to make those connections is so important, but also embracing all of the different ways that food is grown, all of the different types of food that's grown, and the different needs and preferences that we have within people in our state. So again, hats off to NASDA for helping us as states connect with other states and some of the challenges. Our federal partners who help us do that too. USDA has been incredibly helpful as we work through some of these things. And then also our extension services within at least Iowa State Extension from my perspective, but local community efforts as well. So I think it's an all hands on deck kind of approach, and we always appreciate the collaboration.
Great, thank you so much. And for those who maybe aren't familiar with NASDA, we are an association of state departments of ag, and so we bring folks together so that they can share best practices in their region, but also across state lines and across the country. I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Greenberg now for a final question until I kind of open it up to the panel. And if we have additional questions from folks who are listening, we'll go ahead and field those as well. But Commissioner, with all that you've seen and learned over this past year, how has your thinking changed about the role of local and regional food systems in your state's ag and food economy? What priorities or goals do you have moving forward? And it might be even just highlighting things that you knew were already there, but now they've really kind of come to the forefront. But what are those kind of big picture things that you're identifying through this horrible pandemic?
Well, I think we saw play out throughout the pandemic what many of us who have worked in ag a long time have seen the trend lines moving toward, which is local has a certain amount of resilience to it. We saw, when we get too much of our food system consolidated through too few avenues, operated by too few people, it really doesn't leave either producers or consumers with the choice that I think we're seeing develop in our marketplaces. The pandemic really put an exclamation point on that. And of course, that's not to say that, you know, one is good, one is bad. This is not a value judgment so much as reflecting on how do we build greater resilience into the system. You know, I think our efficiency has gotten us to an incredible place of being able to feed billions of people. Now with the what we're facing, pandemic, climate, food access and security, in my mind, efficiency is not the ultimate target, right? I think in thinking about resilience, we think about redundancy. We think about if this part of the system fails, how can we make sure the rest of it can fill in and keep the whole system moving? I'm thinking about equity. How do we, you know, again, this is not just point A to point B as fast as we can, as efficient as we can. How do we make sure that the folks who are not already a part of that system have access to the system we're trying to build? I think the local and regional food efforts throughout the pandemic have hammered a lot of that home, and has been talked about so much. It is not an either or scenario. It is not, well, we're no longer going to be advancing our commodity growers so we can advance local growers, right? It is, we are rising the tide to lift all boats. And I think the more that we connect folks who are not in agriculture with food, with agriculture and the people who do the work, the more opportunity we're going to have, even as we urbanize, to build back some of these bridges. And we're facing that like so many states. We've got such a rapidly growing urban population, which is driving some of this local food market, but we've still got a crevice between us, or canyon, a lot of places where I think we're like ships in the night. We're not understanding each other, and it's hard to hear each other, even if we're working toward the same goal. And what I hope is that whether it's through local or regional, whether it's through conventional commodity, whether it's through the processing sector or food security, food access, I think we all are working in this same field together. And the more that we can step back, listen, talk to each other civilly, and think about what our shared goals are, the more we're going to, again, rise the tide and watch more boats be lifted as we do it.
Thank you. I appreciate all the uplifting words. I'm feeling pretty confident. I don't know how you guys are feeling, but there's a lot of good work that's happening, and we have some smart minds around the table who are working hard with their head and their heart to make it happen. So with that, I'll ask Lillian, do we have any other questions that have come up in the chat that we should address, or are we feeling good? Okay.
We are feeling good. I'm going to, if I can manage my share screens, I've got just some closing things to share with folks as we wrap up here in the next minute. Technology.
Lillian,
Okay.
just so much rich stuff was shared. Just remind folks we will be sending a summary sometime in the near future, because I think people probably had trouble capturing everything that went through the chat box.
Yeah, so if you shared links or if you've been sitting on one, get it in the chat now. We will download it all. We put out a 1 to 2 page summary of the high points, although this one will be really hard to summarize that tight. Thank you, Brittany, my graduate assistant who does that work for us. Those will be posted on our website. You know this webinar, so you should know that website up there. The recording will be there, and we will include the links that are shared in examples in that summary. So lots of great ways, as well as the links Leilani and others have shared to the great databases and resources. There's so much good stuff up there. And I will remind you, these are our monthly webinars. So in February, we have another guest facilitator, Dr. Jasmine Ratliff. She's based out of New Orleans, and she does food system work. And we're leading a conversation on cooperative economies. And we're thinking of that really expansively, both formal co-ops, but also community food economies in a lot of the formal and informal ways that on the ground. If you're interested in this conversation of equity and access to food, how are we creatively responding to that within local and regional food systems, sliding scales, grower collaboratives, other sorts of things? That'll be in February. You can see the other topics. So join us in the coming months. Lots of great conversations to be had. That's our website. Well, I'm sure Dawn can drop a link if you haven't visited there yet. That's our local food website, the resource of innovation briefs, everything we mentioned. If you've got ideas, thoughts, feedback, please reach out to us. We'll be sure to connect you with whatever resources we can. And we're right at time. I am filled with immense gratitude for our panelists today. Let's all give like a, you can use your Zoom response, give a virtual like, yay, clapping hands. It feels inadequate, but yeah, so grateful for the expertise that was shared with us, for the deep wealth of information, experience. I won't use the inspiring word, but I feel motivated. How about that? I've got a fire under my behind to keep doing this work, to keep having these conversations. I thank you all for your candor, your honesty, you're willing to sit with these ideas. And we can stick around a little bit to make sure everyone can get their links in the chat. But that's all we have today, and we'll see you next month.